So we're just going to wait another second or two longer for the numbers to come in, and then we'll get started in a minute or so. So you can see the numbers coming in. I think that is, we're up to 28. That's so wonderful to hear that we have 28 participants. What I'm going to do now, friends, is I'm going to start my introductions and everybody can join in, and then we'll get started. So I want to welcome you to our virtual talk, The Local and International Politics of Sarnia's Airborne Chemical Pollution during the 1960s and 1970s. My name is Christina Sidorko, and I am the Educational Program Coordinator here at the Oil Museum of Canada National Historic Site. I'll be the moderator for this presentation evening, and I'm going to begin with some background information about some of our participants for using Zoom. You can use the chat box to talk with other webinar attendees or to make comments. If you want to send a message to the whole group, please make sure that you've selected all attendees. To get the chat started, you are welcome to share where you're joining us from tonight. And you can put your questions in the chat box or use the Q&A button to submit your questions, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. I will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A throughout the entire presentation. I also will be recording the presentation tonight, and you will receive a link via email so you can watch it again or share it with friends. It will also, in a couple days, be posted to our YouTube channel at the Oil Museum of Canada so that we could share this with everybody who was unable to attend this evening. The Oil Museum of Canada is a nationally designated historic site. It's situated in the historical oil fields of Oil Springs, located in Ontario's first designated Industrial Heritage District and recognized under the Ontario Heritage Act. The museum preserves and interprets the important history of Lambton's innovation and global contributions to the pioneering oil industry. The main exhibition was constructed in 1960 and houses over 9,000 artifacts that interpret the history and influence of Lambton's oil heritage. In 2001, we started a renovation project that closed our doors to the public to complete capital investments, replacing aging equipment and building systems that were beyond their life cycles. We refreshed the main exhibition gallery with more interactive displays, and in 2022, the museum won an Award of Excellence from the Ontario Museum Association for our revitalized exhibits. We are also the site that preserves the history of the first commercial oil well in North America, since this is the site where the oil industry has its roots and its beginning in North America. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Owen Temby from the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. Owen Temby has a PhD from Carleton University and is an environmental science professor at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, and an environmental governance specialist with the current research in air pollution and fishery policies. Before joining UTRGV, Dr. Temby worked as a postdoctoral fellow at McGill University and Carleton University. He is the author of numerous articles in respected journals and the editor, with Peter Stott, of the book Towards Continental Environmental Policy, North America's Transnational Networks and Governance. For his work on the history of Ontario's air pollution politics, he's a 3-time winner of the Ontario Historical Society's Riddle Award for the best article of the year in Ontario history. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Temby with us, and feel free to share your screen and you can get started, and I'm going to mute myself.
Thank you for the very generous introduction. I would like all of you to travel with me back in time for the next hour to Sarnia. Perhaps you're already in Sarnia, but in the 1960s, maybe some of you lived in Sarnia in the 1960s. But I want to take you back not just to Sarnia, but also to larger Ontario and Toronto, because things that were happening in Ontario on a broader scale are also part of this story. This was a time of tremendous post-war economic growth throughout the province, but this growth was inevitably accompanied by some bad stuff. Toronto had a substantial air pollution problem by the mid-1950s. Local Chamber of Commerce, called the Metropolitan Toronto Civic Conference, pushed for a provincial law to regulate air pollution throughout the province, to create a model bylaw that all municipalities would be required to adopt. They got their law in 1958, but the Canadian Manufacturers Association managed to get it watered down so that it gave the municipal governments all of the authority to regulate all air pollution. And I mean all air pollution, including mobile sources. Toronto created what at the time was an impressive air pollution bylaw and an accompanying bureau to enforce it. By the way, the biggest one-time improvement in Toronto's air happened when locomotives and lake freighters switched to liquid fuel for reasons unrelated to municipal regulations in the 1960s. That meant that Sarnia also had the sole authority to regulate air pollution within its municipal boundary. As those of you locals know, that meant that north of Exmouth Street and west of Christina was off limits because that was Point Edward, where Holmes Foundry was. Okay, back to Sarnia. The town's population was sandwiched between two especially heavy polluters. Located on the southern end of Sarnia, Chemical Valley was one of a kind. There was no other petrochemical complex of its size and concentration in North America. It consisted of 10 firms at the beginning of the 1960s, 12 by the end, employing around 7,000 workers. The firms included a Canadian Crown Corporation, Polymer Corp, multinational corporations, Dow Chemical, Shell, and privately held domestic firms. They experimented with and produced a variety of petrochemical products, solvents, ammonia, polyurethane plastics, and as many antecedents such as styrene, glycol, rubber, latex, chlorine, fiberglass, and others. It was clear to all that they produced a lot of air pollution, but nobody at that time fully knew what was being released into the atmosphere. Dow released chlorine gas, for example, might have released ammonia and chemicals involved in the manufacture of plastics. A great amount of energy was needed to power these industrial facilities, and that meant that coal-fired industrial boilers used by the firms produce a lot of sulfur dioxide and dark smoke, but so the many other coal-fired power plants throughout the region. At the other end of the city, fewer than 2 miles north of Chemical Valley, or as I put, about as what I can walk in 20 minutes, was Holmes Foundry. I have a photo of Holmes Foundry I'll show you in a moment. It engineered engine blocks for automobiles, but also asbestos insulation. For you Sarnians here, this is on the north side of Exmouth Street between Front and Christina Street. Holmes Foundry employed 700 people and was financially troubled by the mid-1960s. It had been struggling to survive since going into receivership during summer 1966. So neither Sarnia nor Point Edward was going to burden the owners by requiring the plant to install expensive abatement equipment. There's not much there now, by the way. The old parking lot and chain link fence, last time I saw it, the last two buildings were removed 2 years ago. It looks like a big remediation job right now. To the west, across the river, was the international border and Port Huron. Residents in Port Huron in the 1960s frequently complained to their mayor about the air pollution problem. Sarnia has an aesthetically beautiful location on the Great Lakes Waterway. In the mid-1960s, it was apparent to all that the city also had a bright future. It had the highest per capita income in Canada, and it rose throughout the decade in the 1960s. In 1961, it merely had the highest per capita income in Ontario. By comparison, in Toronto, the weekly per capita income was $81 a week, And Sudbury, which there was substantial industry, was $91. Sarnia was 101. By the end of the decade, it was $137 a week, the highest in Canada. Population in the city was expected to double and soar past 100,000 people in 20 years by the mid-80s. The downtown was not particularly attractive, but they knew it and they were working on it. The waterfront site was purchased by the city and converted to Centennial Park. It's too bad the earth had been salted. Literally, it used to be a salt producer. One way we can learn about Sarnia in the 1960s is to look at the events of an important week in May 1966. Three things happened in May 1966, in the first week of that month, that gave local leaders a big headache, and after which, nothing was ever the same. First, in May 1966, a family physician named John Woodger, who had 3 children, decided to pack up and leave town. He tried to be discreet about it, but someone with which he confided ran to the local media. It was reported in the Toronto Star, which is was one of Canada's largest dailies, and still is, that he had treated an unusually high number of patients for respiratory illness, and said it will probably be 10 or 15 years before anything is done about it, which, by the way, is exactly what happened, or generally what happened. He was right. And by that time, my children will be grown up or dead. That received a lot of publicity from the media and attention from the local Chamber of Commerce. Second, in that week, May 1966, Sarnia's air pollution became an issue for the province's opposition party. Liberal Party leader Andrew Thompson called government inaction on air pollution, quote, a crime against the citizens of the city of Sarnia. He also correctly noted that all of the information about pollution levels was collected and distributed by the Chemical Valley firms. Third, that week in May 1966, the Star published a lengthy feature article called When You Walk in Sarnia, Smog Gets in Your Eyes. It portrayed the town as corrupt, with people fearful of speaking out against the evident source of its prosperity. It mentioned how unhappy people were in Port Huron on the US side, how unhappy they were about receiving this pollution, and it depicted local business and political leaders as very defensive. The response by these local leaders was indeed defensive, reactionary, and substantial. They were hypersensitive. You can see it in the minutes of the city council meetings and in the articles and editorials of the local newspaper, the very boosterish at the time, Sarnia Observer. And what happened to a vocal local allergist, who I'll discuss later, is also instructive of their hypersensitivity. There are many perspectives in which to understand this very bad week and what followed. We can look at it from the perspective of the wave of environmentalism and environmental policy that followed in the next half decade, none of which was in view at this time. It wasn't obvious that any of this was going to happen, that this was an early sign that the dam was about to break. But what I want you to consider is, first, the way it was understood when it happened. This will help us to understand what it meant to live in Sarnia at the time, and it will help us to understand the way that local leaders reacted and how it is that they reacted that way. To do that, we have to know something about the North American chemical industry in the mid-1960s. We can make some generalizations about the chemical industry pre-1970. Throughout the pre-1970 20th century, and especially from the 30s through the 60s, chemical firms went to great lengths to integrate into the local community and maintain a favorable public image. The objective was to lessen the probability of backlash from chemical pollution and to forestall regulation. The industrial engineers who ascended to the upper ranks of corporate executives and industry leaders claimed that regulations were bad for business, and perhaps most importantly, threatened to force the disclosure of trade secrets that they had developed in their innovative work. To make the case that regulations were unnecessary and maintain exclusive control over production processes, the chemical industry developed waste management policies and formed multi-firm committees to disseminate information about best practices in waste management. These multi-firm committees arose in the locales where there were complexes, where the chemical industry had these complexes. This enabled the chemical firms to set the standards on which they would be judged. The industry's main trade association, the Manufacturers Chemists Association, promoted inter-firm exchange and encouraged firms to take responsible waste disposal seriously. It was standard to maintain exclusive control of manufacturing knowledge and to embed themselves into the social fabric of the community in which they were based so they could maintain control. This trade group, the Manufacturers Chemists Association, advised firms to handle their minor PR problems locally. It advised them to handle their minor PR problems locally so that they didn't get out of control. The standard way to do this was to acknowledge the evident problem, to portray the problem as the cost of prosperity, to claim to spend substantially on reducing it, and to depict the problem as a mere nuisance instead of a health threat. All of these tendencies that I just said to you, which are well documented in examination of other chemical complexes and firms, were exhibited by Sarnia's Chemical Valley firms. Local industry executives had leadership roles throughout Sarnia in multiple community organizations. When during the 1950s, the city council considered passing an air pollution bylaw and commissioned a study, this happened in 1952, the firms quickly organized into a regional industrial association with the research branch to self-govern and publicize their efforts in preventing pollution. This was to head off any kind of regulation. This arrangement gave Chemical Valley exclusive access to all data about pollution levels in the city. The result was an organization that was created called the St. Clair River Research Committee. Perhaps some of you have heard of it. If you haven't, you've almost certainly heard of its descendant organization that I'll mention in a moment. Air pollution in Sarnia was not considered much of a problem by City Council, the Chamber of Commerce, the local health unit, or the city's industrial firms. To the extent that it was mentioned in public discourse, it was an acknowledged nuisance that inevitably accompanies industrial economic prosperity. The city's air pollution was not a public health problem, nor was it a salient political issue that the government need address with a municipal bylaw or provincial regulation. It was convenient for policymakers to accept Chemical Valley's claim that whatever problem that existed was under control. The chemical industry had been severely stung by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, and by Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed in 1966. Even though they didn't directly affect them, they were cognizant of it. And the political fallout was something that they did not want to repeat with the PR disaster, with another PR disaster. And that led to a hypersensitivity for bad press and for a desire to work locally to control problems before they got out of control. This is the context in which Chemical Valley and Sarnia's local leaders responded to their very bad week in May 1966. When I talk about Chemical Valley, I partly mean an organization through which they organized, the organization through which they organized, the interfirm organization, to maintain control over research and informed discussion of the pollution issue, especially air pollution. They formed this organization in 1953 called the St. Clair River Research Committee to head off initially the possibility of a bylaw. This inter-firm organization conducted the research, released reports, communicated with the media and city, and shared information with provincial health authorities. But the only information they shared was the information on which they collected data, and they chose which types of data to collect. If you want to know more about the St. Clair River Research Committee and other parts of the local political system that maintain the status quo, I refer you to my recent journal article on the topic. All of the Chemical Valley firms were members and financed the St. Clair River Research Committee's work, as was Holmes Foundry, even though it wasn't technically in Chemical Valley. Very importantly, it did not measure pollution from specific facilities. It measured ambient levels of oxides, nitrogen oxide, and dioxides, and particulates in the town. It did not measure the funky chemicals that were emitted by the firms, nor did it share this information with the public. And it said it didn't want to. It was afraid that people would misinterpret it and be alarmed. In many ways, the Sarnia Observer served as the medium for the transmission of information about air quality. And they would communicate with the Sarnia Observer through their reports and directly, who would then present it favorably to the population. Other important parts of the local system included the Lambton County Medical Society, the Lambton Health Unit, the Sarnia Observer, the Chemical Valley executives who had leadership roles in community organizations like the Chamber of Commerce, the YMCA, the Humane Society, the Rheumatism Society, the Hospital Commission, the Library Board, the City Council, and I could go on. The Globe and Mail referred to this as official Sarnia in 1967. And this was all out of the North American chemical industry's playbook for tamping down on political contestation. This was not just a Sarnia thing, but Sarnia was a good example of it. By the way, here's a factoid for you locals. The St. Clair River Research Committee eventually became known as first the Lambton Industrial Society, and then the Sarnia Lambton Environmental Association, until a couple of years ago, when it got swallowed up into the new Blue Water Association. When I reached out to what at the time was the Sarnia Lambton Environmental Association some years ago to see if they could help me locate materials about their past, I couldn't find any institutional memory. Or maybe they didn't want to talk to me. Who knows? But normally with organizations like that, it's that they really just don't remember the past. That's been given to archives, and whatever's there is what's available. And fortunately, I was able to find quite a bit about this organization in the Lambton County archives. But if anybody knows more about it, especially about its actions in the 1950s and 60s, please let me know. One way to look at this system in Sarnia is how it managed contestation, not just how it managed status quo in the best of times, but how it managed the contestation that inevitably arose because people were unhappy with the air. I became interested in the story of a young allergist who observed respiratory problems with his patients and spoke up about it. He was in his mid-30s and set up his practice in Sarnia in 1962. This is William Van Hugenhuis. He noticed right away that his patients, and he's an allergist, had substantial breathing problems. He went to city council in 1964 and advocated for a leaf burning ban. The local health authority, the Lambton Health Unit, advocated against it, saying there's no reason for this. Hugenhuis was not happy. He said this doesn't make sense. He complained, but there were other complaints too, mostly about Holmes Foundry, but the local health authority dismissed those as well. So this is a mere nuisance. Most importantly, the mayor of Port Huron started complaining about it and requesting an international investigation. This made Chemical Valley very unhappy, and we will see why. During this moment of unhappiness, this is now in August 1965, Van Hoogenhuis, after seeing many more of his patients have problems, went back to the city council and spoke more about the health effects of air pollution in town. This time with more data. The city council minutes give a good account of all of this. They brought along the head of the St. Clair River Research Committee, their chairman, to rebut him, so that he wouldn't be there alone saying these things about air pollution in Sarnia. And then after this meeting occurred and there was this rebuttal, they reported back to the mayor of Port Huron to say they were more impressed with the chairman of the St. Clair River Research Committee. But undeterred, Dr. Van Hoogenhuis convinced the Lambton County Medical Society to form a committee to study the air pollution problem in Sarnia. This, of course, threatened to undermine industry's monopoly of information. The committee was just getting going when, in May 1966, Sarnia had its very bad week. If I could encapsulate exactly what happened to Dr. Van Hoogenhuis, and I talk about this a bit in my journal article, but if I could encapsulate exactly what happened to him, it's that it would be this. After this very bad May 1966 week, when Dr. Woodger left, or quietly as much as possible left, Dr. Van Hoogenhuis naively jumped in front of the microphone. They had tolerated him as long as they felt they were in control, but now they didn't feel as though they were in control, and he was fanning the flames. The Liberal leader, who had been spotlighting Sarnia's pollution problem, contacted Van Hoogenhuis, who was almost certainly the doctor that Thompson was using to claim authority on the topic. Van Hoogenhuis said that the city needed more regulation. He publicly called for $1 million study between Sarnia's pollution and public health, the links between its pollution and public health. And this was all too much for the people in power, especially given this state of heightened sensitivity, which was evident at that time. Right away, the Lambton Medical Society disbanded the air pollution committee he chaired. At the Medical Society's request, the Ontario Medical Association's ethics committee cited him for making unauthorized public statements. And he stopped talking to the media. But something else happened. And this is the next part of the story that was not within sight. Complaints by Port Huron Mayor Dr. Donald Wismer convinced leaders of both countries, complaints about Sarnia's air pollution in Port Huron, convinced the leaders of both countries to allow the International Joint Commission to include Port Huron Sarnia in the next phase of its ongoing international investigation into Detroit, Windsor area air pollution. Okay, the IJC. My students who are here, some of them, the grad students, know what the IJC is because I have required them to read about the IJC in recent weeks. This is a 100-year-old binational organization that governs transboundary water issues between Canada and the United States. It has only gotten involved in air pollution in two cases. One in the 1930s was a smelter in British Columbia that was polluting farmland in Washington State, the famous Trail Smelter case. The other was Detroit Windsor, and eventually Port Huron Sarnia. The way the IJC worked at that time is that both countries, through their foreign ministry, would request that it initiate an investigation of a specific issue. So whether an investigation would take place, was itself a matter for international negotiation. Both had to agree to an international investigation. The investigation into Sarnia was announced in September 1966. So right as a few months after that very bad week, and right as things were spiraling out of control for Chemical Valley, for the St. Clair River Research Committee, then the Lambton County Industrial Society, and for Chemical Valley's monopoly on information. Basically, for decades, the IJC had been looking into pollution sent to Windsor from Detroit, especially from places like Zug Island, Lake Freighters, all those coal plants in Michigan. But the investigations had been limited in scope because the US had nothing to gain from them. So they did limited investigations that made limited recommendations. Now that the Americans were complaining about Canadian pollution, the two sides were able to compromise and have a dual Detroit-Windsor and Port Huron-Sarnia investigation that would be a more meaningful investigation. They both had something to win. The board conducting the investigation held public meetings in 1967 in Windsor and in Port Huron, and in 1971 in Sarnia and Detroit. That was to discuss the 1971 report that they had drafted, eventually released in 72, that they had done based on research in 1967 through 1971. Fortunately for me, as a researcher, those meetings are documented, and so the statements that the various actors made are in the archives, and the change in tone between 1967, before the study, and 1971, when the study was available, was remarkable. But I want to be careful to point out that the pollutants examined in the report were just the normal ones, not the exotic stuff likely coming from the petrochemical plants. So it likely underestimated the toxic effect of what was coming from Sarnia, and the toxic effect of what it measured. The report showed that Chemical Valley's main victims were Sarnians, not the habitants of Port Huron. The report noted this, saying that, quote, "The high level of pollution in Sarnia is to a large extent attributable to emissions originating in that jurisdiction. Most of Port Huron's bad air, it turns out, came from Michigan. That doesn't mean that they weren't smelling chemicals from Sarnia. That we'll never know. They used to report a turnip smell coming from Sarnia. But for the purpose of the report and what followed, Sarnia was creating its own problem. But here's the most important two things that came from the investigation. One is that it resulted in recommended binational air pollution standards, which at the time, again, were oxides and particulates, none of the toxics that later were measured in the subsequent decades. By this time, in 1971, both the US and Ontario had passed new air pollution laws, enabling them to regulate the problem. Ontario could issue control orders on individual facilities, and so could the US. The report also resulted in the creation of a Michigan-Ontario Air Pollution Committee, a subnational committee, to formulate measures to improve air, and a Michigan-Ontario Memorandum of Understanding, basically a subnational treaty, to achieve the International Joint Commission's recommended air pollution standards by the end of the 1970s. As a result, and it resulted in the creation of an IJC board that from the mid-1970s reported annually about progress. And indeed, regional air quality improvements following the report were substantial for the first several years. The total number of suspended particulates in the region dropped by half, from 71 to 75. And Sarnia's unwanted experience in the limelight in the late 1960s provoked a series of modernizations at several Chemical Valley facilities that led them to emit fewer pollutants, at least the pollutants that were measured. But air pollution failed to fall further in the latter half of the 1970s. It essentially got to a certain point around 75 and stayed there for much of the rest of the decade. What made the difference eventually was the early 80s recession and deindustrialization of the region. The IJC, seeing this, declared success and disbanded the Air Pollution Board in 1984. And that's it. That's the end of that story. The IJC looked into the issue a bit more in the subsequent decade, but never got much into the air pollution again. I want to thank the helpful people in the Lambton County Archives for their assistance with this work, the Oil Museum of Canada for putting this event on, the wonderful staff in City Hall in Sarnia for opening their archives to me, the IJC in Ottawa for doing the same, and a heartfelt thanks to the Van Hoogenhuis family for helping locate valuable documents and sharing their experiences. Finally, I want to offer a personal exhortation to the good people of Sarnia, especially the retirees out there. I have found that if I am ever lacking for my research or just in life, in inspiration, there's a place to which I can turn for a limitless source of inspiration: the local history of a town, especially a town with good archives. There are so many stories to learn about and tell from the vantage point of the present. It's there waiting to be discovered. And in Lambton County, you have the advantage of at least two excellent sources. Of course, there's the Lambton County Archives. The other is City Hall. They have the original minutes of all their city council meetings going back as far as I wanted to know, and with lots of detail. And those minutes record citizen correspondence to City Hall, which is stored on microfilm. So the minutes are just the beginning. And then there's all the letters that are available that people send to the city that you can have access to. So if you're looking for something fulfilling to do, I encourage you to take advantage of the resources available in your town and learn about its history. If you don't, nobody else will. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions.
So the chat line is open. The Q&A is open. I encourage you, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat or drop them in the Q&A, and I will be happy to share them with Dr. Temby. So I'll give you guys a few minutes to kind of get into the chat or into the Q&A to think about, or if there's people joining us from outside the Sarnia-Lambton area, if you have any questions about Sarnia-Lambton, the old Holmes Foundry site is one that we are very familiar with, as it's right next to the football field.
I apologize for replacing your face with my screen. I forgot that I have some photos to share. This is part of Chemical Valley from the IJC archives. This is more of it, 1967, from the Sarnia Observer archive negative collection. Some of you may recognize this. This is Holmes Foundry. These are the leaders of the St. Clair River Research Committee at the time. This is the Sarnia. Anybody recognize this? This is the Chamber of Commerce logo in the mid-1960s. I think this really says it all. This sort of encapsulates.
For those international students, one of the things that you should understand is that in the 1980s, Chemical Valley featured on the back of the $10 bill. It was an area and moment of pride for industrial heritage, and it showed the industrialization of the community and the country. So it was prominently featured on the back of the $10 bill for the Canadian currency. It is a matter of local pride. Those plants are still there. I think it was at that period of time called Polystar, was the image featured, and those look like this, the styrene area, those big bubbles are round tanks for styrene.
This is a bird. This is a sailboat. There's Chemical Valley. This is a good example of that sort of post-World War II optimism, that technology was great. We can have it all. Boat, beautiful spot at the river, on the waterway, and all in harmony. And this is Dr. Van Hugenhuis, who the allergist who spoke up.
So we're still waiting for some questions or some comments to come into the webinar. So please feel free to if you have any comments or if you have stories that you would like to share, you're more than welcome to share them. If you have any questions about the Sarnia-Lambton area, hopefully I can answer questions about Sarnia-Lambton. It was Sifto Salt was the salt company that operated the salt caverns beneath the city of Sarnia. And that company still operates today. So if you go to the grocery store, you can buy a box of Sifto salt. It's what we put on our French fries.
I heard that the Holmes Foundry site was just sold last year.
I'm unaware of the specifics of that. You may be correct. It does have to go through a decontamination because Holmes Foundry was there for quite a while. And it was not a very pleasant place. So we have a question from Bree. What were the most damaging chemicals recorded, and what were their effects on human health?
I don't know. That would require an environmental toxicologist. There may be people who have done that work. This issue has been examined from many different angles in subsequent years. But the research that I did doesn't look at that stuff because it wasn't well known at the time what those chemicals were.
So we have an anonymous attendee. Just a sec, let me. How would you describe the air quality of Sarnia today? So, Dr. Temby, if you want to take it, or I can give you some local notes.
I'd rather hear from the local.
So I live just outside of Sarnia. It's not bad today. It was a lot different 20 or 30 years ago. There's been a lot of work in the last recent years by Chemical Valley. And because we do have, in 1986, we have the MISCA Act coming in, which is the Municipal Industrial Strategy for Abatement. And we also have all of those reports from the St. Clair Watershed Commissions about areas of concern. There's a different JIC report on water quality. And the industry itself has decided there is a carrot and stick approach. The community has really put the effort to say that some pollution was just no longer acceptable. And over the last 40 years, there's been a radical shift in society going through and saying we need workplace health and safety, we need to clean up things, we need to have closed loop systems. So the air is much more improved compared to when I was a child, as compared to other things. And you can check out real-time data from Clean Air Sarnia at Lambton. So there is a website, it's called CASA. So thank you to the person that made that comment. And it is available in real time. And there are, I think, 10 or more air monitoring stations located in Sarnia-Lambton, either in Sarnia or on Aamjiwnaang First Nation, and in different spots located along the river.
The other scholar who has studied Canadian American air pollution a lot, the policy, is a retired faculty member from UNBC named Don Munton. And he did a lot of research on the acid rain issue when that was happening. And I did too. And we worked together on some pieces recently on some book chapters on Canadian environmental air pollution policy, and also on a chapter on Sarnia and trail in a book that was celebrating the IJC's 100th birthday. And one question that Don and I would ask each other and ourselves is how is it that there isn't any more binational US Canadian treaties, policy, investigations into binational air pollution? There's no new annexes or protocols added to the binational agreement, the air quality agreement that was originally an acid rain treaty, but eventually became other stuff like nitrogen oxide. There's been no further references to the IJC over the air pollution issue. And we said, well, actually, we think we know. The air pollution is not as bad as it used to be. The air isn't as bad as it used to be. And transboundary air pollution is nothing comparable to what it was when we had coal-fired locomotives, lake freighters, dirtier cars, and coal-fired power plants throughout this region.
So there is another question in the chat. How does Sarnia's air quality compare to other cities in Ontario? I personally do not have those statistics. I do know that our air, from a personal perspective, is a lot better than it was. We shut down the coal-fired plant. OPG is no longer in operation. And there are a tremendous amount of regulations within this community to regulate what comes out of the stacks and about emissions, because we have local access to air quality monitoring stations that you can monitor in real time. If you understand how to read particulate matter, it'll have like a red, green, kind of yellow system that we do monitor and that anybody from the general public can go in and look at. And there are safety protocols that everybody is taught in this area, that if you hear a siren, what are your protocols for operations? So if we hear a siren and it is not a Monday at 12 noon, go inside, close the windows, shut off the air intake.
For those of you who have never been to Sarnia or are here from the US, I hope I didn't give a bad impression of this wonderful place. It's a very lovely place.
Yes, you should come visit and eat French fries under the bridge. This is what we do. We eat French fries and we wave at Americans because we can literally see the United States.
It's one of my favorite crossings. I love the restaurants in Sarnia. I love the beautiful people and the location. It's aesthetically gorgeous. It's not an awful place. And I was only half joking when I said 20 minutes from Holmes Foundry to Chemical Valley with my long legs. I've done the walk. I can do it quickly down the main street. It's just a lovely place.
The beaches are quite nice. So yes, we do have blue water. It's why it's called blue water. If you noticed when I had my camera turned off, the logos for the county have three key elements. We have the blue waters as we are on the shores of Lake Huron and the St. Clair. We have the wheat sheaf because the secondary major industry in this community is agricultural production of wheat, soybeans, and corn, which we are currently harvesting. And the third is the petrochemical industry and the oil industry, as this is the site of the first commercial oil well in North America. And a lot of the research that we do here at the museum focuses on the 1800s and early 1900s for the development of that industry and the real-time learnings about environmental pollution and its impact on the communities in the 1800s, particularly in oil springs or petroleum. So thank you. We've had a few chats saying thank you for hosting this. We are glad that you were able to participate and allowing the window into the past. We do encourage you to come visit. If you're local, come visit us here at the Oil Museum of Canada. If you are not local, please follow us online. You can follow us on Facebook. You can follow our website. We are on Instagram as well, where we put a lot of information about programs or opportunities or just basic information that we are learning about what goes on in the history of this industry. On the behalf of the Oil Museum of Canada, I want to thank Dr. Owen Temby for being our guest speaker this evening. and presenting such an industry talk about local history in the 1960s as related to this topic that is very near and dear to every person in Sarnia, as we all have experiences related to breathing the air in Sarnia, and we've all smelt some of the smells, particularly in oil springs where you can smell the money coming out of the ground. Your support is critical to preserving and sharing local history and the stories of our community. The recording for tonight's talk will be available shortly to you on YouTube, and it will be emailed to each participant. In the meantime, I want to see all of you at local events, if you are local, from Lambton Museums and Archives, and check out lambtonmuseums.ca. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and you are all welcome to follow us on our different social media channels. And if you want to check out any of our educational programs, feel free to go to our website. We also will Zoom to you. So I love Zoom.
Me too.
Yeah, this talk would not be possible to fly people across the country. Texas is a little bit far for us here in Southern Ontario. So I'm going to stop the recording.